Good afternoon. Today we're going to talk about the video How to Fix the Economy. We're going to make an analysis of the topics GDP, saving paradox, fiscal policies, and monetary policies. I am Fiorella Moraga.
I'm Sherry Madrid.
I'm Pamela Alvarado.
And I'm Kaylin Reyes.
The first topic we're going to talk about is gross domestic product. Okay, first of all, according to Krugman and Wells 2016, gross domestic product or GDP is the value of all final goods and services produced in an economy. And also, as mentioned in the video, the pandemic has been a huge shock to the economy, and it cost the world GDP for 2020 to be 7.5% lower than it would have been without the effects of the coronavirus. And as stated by Mora 2020, the GDP growth rate is calculated by the formula GDP1 minus GDP0 divided by GDP0. So the expected rate of 2020 is calculated by GDP of 2020 minus GDP of 2019 divided by the GDP of 2019. And the result, as mentioned before, is 7.5% lower than it would have been without the virus. From the above, it is interpreted that the value of production of final goods and services of the world contracted as a result of the coronavirus, which causes the rate to experience a reduction. And furthermore, Krugman and Wells 2016 established that the most important use of GDP is as a measure of the economy's size. So we can also say that this GDP is formed by the sum of private consumption plus investment plus public consumption plus the value of exports minus the value of imports. And all these factors influence the behavior of the economy, and when experiencing an event with a great magnitude, such as the pandemic or the Second World War, these are modified, generating unemployment, inflation, decreases of GDP, among others, as it is established in the video. If you can pass to the next. Moreover, since GDP is a tool used to measure the economy, it reflects how the economy sector worldwide was strongly affected this year. As shown in the graph, the GDP of 2020 that is expected, it was expected that we have a GDP1 here we can see in the graph, but it is going to be GDP2 that is 7.5% less than it would have been without the effects of the coronavirus. So this is the effect that the coronavirus produced in the world GDP rate.
Krugman and Wells explain why this crisis happened through the saving paradox, in which if agents start to consume less as a result, the employers will receive less income and therefore will have to lay off some of their staff. In this way, unemployment rate will increase, which is reflected at the beginning of the news, where it says that the unemployment rate in the United States of April in this year was the highest since the Great Depression due to the COVID-19. Okay, this effect, the effect that this year will produce in the economy is that each time the income will be lower due to the unemployment, and consequently, the aggregate savings will be lower too, which is reflected in the news because it says that the government faces this crisis, tightening their belts instead of spending, by cutting spendings to balance their budgets. In the same way, the population reduced its expenses due to the increase in employment and the fear of the new reality. And to understand this situation, we must understand the formula of aggregate demand or GDP, which is the following. where AD represents the aggregate demand, C, the consumption of economic agents as a whole, I are the investments made by the companies, G, the public's expenditure, X are the exports made by the country, and M are the imports made by the country. And in this case, consumption is what explains this event. Since the families start to save, they will not consume, and therefore the aggregate demand will have to move to the left, as we see it in the chart below. So this is the reason why GDP was so affected in many countries, as my classmate Fiorella explained before. And finally, as the news says, the way that the governments responded to the crisis caused by the pandemic was pretty different from the way government responded to the Great Depression of the 1930s. This is because economists try to understand these events to know how to prevent them or to know how to act during them. And thanks to that commitment, it was possible to get the response so quickly today.
I'm going to talk about fiscal policies and compare them with fragments of the news. Fiscal policy uses changes in taxes and public spending in order to influence total spending and in this way encourage the expansion of the economy. Government transfers or transfers to families, which according to Krugman and Wells are another type of public expenditure that are payments made by the government to families. For example, the news mentions that Congress in America announced $2 trillion stimulus package with the goal of making direct cash payments to nearly all Americans. Pass, please. As with households, recessions are bad for businesses along with employment and wage, as profits fail during recessions, causing many businesses to fail. For example, when the world went into lockdown due to the pandemic caused by COVID-19, millions of companies had operational incapacity and couldn't pay their payroll. This is why governments were forced to respond by implementing fiscal policies for companies as well. Finally, according to Krugman and Wells, GDP is made up of the sum of C, I, G, X minus imports. Therefore, any change in some of the variables in the equation will cause GDP to increase or decrease, and the country's economy, may expand or reduce. So, government transfers increase the private consumption of families, and financial aid to companies increases the investments of these organizations. Therefore, by increasing private consumption and investments, the percentage of GDP would increase, which would help reduce the recession countries around the world.
Now I will explain the monetary policies. Can you pass, please? Thank you. In this news, they talk about a strong recession due to COVID-19 and mention that the government is generating over expenses which are used to finance family income payments, grant licenses to millions of workers and rescue companies. So they went to the banks to obtain loans, and however, some banks to keep borrowing cuts have created 4 trillion in new money and lowered their interest rates. As I mentioned in the news, there is a big recession, and according to Krugman and Wells, recession or contraction are periods of economic downturn when output and employment fall. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the banks lower their interest rates, but how do they determine this interest rate? Krugman and Wells explained that this is due to the supply and demand for money, which is why the aforementioned banks have established very low interest rates, and this due to the demand for money that is occurring at this time. On the other hand, the news says that there is no doubt that there is room for government to support the economy, and that is despite a huge debt by adopting an expansionary monetary policy and increasing the money supply will be able to fight against this recession. This can be corroborated with Krugman and Wells because according to them, when an expansionary monetary policy is used and the money supply is increased, interest rates fall. That increase in investment spending increases income, which increases in private consumption through multipliers, and therefore aggregate demand increase and the AD curve shift to the right, as we can see in the next. Thank you. An increase in the demand for money shifts the demand curve to the right. And in conclusion, we were able to observe how macroeconomics is important in crisis situations for the countries. So to be able to move forward, as we mentioned before, fiscal policies, monetary policies were implemented, and the saving paradox was analyzed to obtain a positive response to these events such as COVID-19. Thank you so much.